I don't think I've learned more from anyone, except perhaps Jesus Christ himself, about how to lead a church than I have from Carey Nieuwhof. Carey Nieuwhof has been formative in my ministry leadership pretty much ever since I started leading worship. I've been following him for a really long time. If you don't know who Carey Nieuwhof is, he has a blog at careynieuwhof.com. I'll link it down in the description below because, as he will admit, his name is pretty hard to spell. He also has a church leadership podcast. Well, it started as a church leadership podcast. I think it's kind of transitioned just into a general leadership podcast at this point, but it's called the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. In fact, I think it used to be called the Church Leadership Podcast. That point is neither here nor there. I've learned so much from Carey Nieuwhof over my time in ministry, just from following his resources online. And I want to share with you today the top 5 things that I've learned, not just about church leadership, but more specifically about how what I've learned from Carey Nieuwhof has applied to my worship ministry and even my worship leading itself. The first thing that I learned from Carey was not even a principle that he was teaching, but it was an illustration that he used to demonstrate a principle that he was teaching. And I think, at my old church, whenever I was serving before, I was preaching semi-regularly, and so I was trying to improve my preaching, and Carey had a lot of info on how to improve your preaching, so I was following along with that, and I think he was talking about creating these statements that people will remember. And I remember him telling the story about how he preached this sermon, I think it was on Jonah, and he preached this sermon, and he was like, that was a good sermon, whatever, it was decent. He didn't hear anything in the moment, but 7 years later or something, somebody came up to him and said, Carey, I still remember when you taught that God's in control, but you have a role. And that is what I've applied to my worship leading. God's in control, but you have a role. And that means so many things to me in my worship leading, that one simple statement: God's in control, but you have a role. I think just from an overarching view of things, God's in control, but you have a role means that God is infinitely sovereign. He's in control of all things, and he is working all things to bring him glory. In his grace, God chooses to use us. God doesn't need us to accomplish his will on earth. He chooses to use us, and that in and of itself is a blessing for us, because we are blessed in the process when God uses us for his glory. And so when it comes to worship leading, I'm reminded once again, God's in control, but I have a role. God doesn't need me to lead worship, but he chooses me out of his abundant grace to use me, to let me use my gifts that he has also given me to serve him. And I am blessed through that process, but it is only because of God's grace that he chooses to use me. He doesn't need me. So that's the first part of it. But then the second part of it, which is kind of what I think Carey was getting at in his original sermon, even though I didn't watch his original sermon, but I assume this was his point, was that yes, God is completely in control of all things, working all things together, and he doesn't need us, but he chooses to use us. So not only is God in control, but he has given us a role to play in his story, and so we need to take that role seriously. So when it comes to worship leading, you have a role. Are you taking it seriously? That's what I ask myself all the time. God doesn't need me, but he has chosen to use me, and so what I offer him in response to that better be worth something. I better put in the work beforehand. And this ties pretty much directly into what I find myself talking a lot about here on this channel, which is preparation. Should we prepare? Because some people say, God's in control. The Holy Spirit will lead me. It's up to God to do whatever he's going to do, and I completely agree with that. But the alternative of that is that we have a role. So when it comes to preparation, we can, yes, trust that the Spirit is working, because it is, and God is ultimately the one in control, but God has given us a role to play, so let's take our preparation seriously. God is in control, but you have a role. And I think it all comes down to what our definition of a worship leader is. My definition of what a worship leader does is a worship leader points people to the worthiness of God and provides them with the opportunity to respond. So that is the role that God has given us, graciously allowed us to do for his glory. He has graciously, through the power of his Spirit, allowed us to point people to him and provide them with the opportunity to respond. That's the second part of the phrase. You have a role, but God is in control. So from that, God uses that however he sees fit. And so it takes the pressure off of us for the specific spiritual response of the people of our congregation, and it lets us just focus on what our role is, which is simply to point people to the worthiness of God and provide them with the opportunity to respond. If we do that, we are fulfilling our role, and God will use that and bless that for his glory, because that is what God is about. God is about bringing himself glory. He is using all things to bring himself glory. God is in control, but you have a role. The second thing that I learned from Carey that has applied to my worship leading and my worship ministry as a whole is simply how to be effective with my time. I remember early on in my ministry, I took an online course from Carey that was called the High Impact Leader course. I think it's called something different now. He just came out with a book called At Your Best, and I'm pretty sure that the course is now called the At Your Best course. But essentially, it was how to overcome burnout in ministry. And I had just started in ministry, and I'm sure if you've been in ministry for however long you've been in ministry, you know that things can be tiring. And so we need to manage our time effectively, or else we will just keep going and going and going and going, because ministry is never done, right? And I think about this to myself all the time. Why is ministry never done? Ministry is never done because we are in the people business. I put that in quotes, heavy quotes, bold quotes. We are in the people business. We are interacting with people, Christians specifically, and Christians are going through the process of sanctification. And so until Christ returns, the work is never done. And so at some point, we have to say during the day, not for eternity, but just during the day, we have to say that our work is done. And so we have to use the time that we have efficiently. And that's what Carey Nieuwhof really started me on the path of learning how to do. So in this course, the High Impact Leader course that I took, he taught me, and I'll just break it down as simply as I can. There's a lot more to it than this. But essentially, he said that if you want to be efficient with your time, then you have to do what you're best at when you're at your best. So instead of trying to balance things and be like, I'm going to do a little bit of this then and a little bit of this there and a little bit of this here and here and here and so on and so forth, you decide this is what I'm best at. This is where I will make the most impact. And so a lot of people can do that in their worship ministry, but the key is then to do that when you're at your best. So we have these time periods in our day where we work the best. For me, it's in the morning, probably from like 7 to 11, maybe. Somewhere in that 4-hour period is probably a little bit shorter than that, but somewhere in there is my best time. And so instead of doing all of the administration tasks that worship leaders have to do, or, putting slides together for Sunday, that's not what I'm best at. That's not what's going to make the most impact in my worship ministry. And so instead of doing that, I would focus on maybe crafting a speaking transition, or maybe really thinking about my worship set and how I can make that as cohesive as possible to support the point that my pastor is leading our church to on Sunday. That is what I feel like I'm best at. So if I do what I'm best at, when I'm at my best, I will create the best results and be the most effective in my ministry with my time. And then I am stewarding the role that God has given me as best as I possibly can. And I'm not just doing all the things. I'm saying, this is what I'm best at because God has gifted me with it. And so I'm going to do that when I'm at my best so that I get the best possible results and in return bring God the most amount of glory that I possibly can. So the simple rule, you can go take the course. Like I said, I think it's called the At Your Best course now, but I'm pretty sure it teaches the same concept. But the simple principle is to do what you're best at when you're at your best. When are you at your best? Is it in the morning? Is it in the early afternoon after you've eaten lunch? Is it in the evening when the kids go to bed? That's not me at all. First of all, I don't have kids, but it's definitely not at 10:30 because I'm asleep by then, but maybe it is for you. It doesn't matter when you're at your best. It just matters that you figure out what that answer is, and then you do what you're best at when you're at your best so that you can get the best possible results. Another thing that I've learned from Carey, and this has to do with criticism in worship ministry. I'm sure that you've been criticized at least once in your worship ministry, but the phrase that he said, and I'm pretty sure he didn't make this up, but this is where I first heard it. I first heard it from him. The phrase is, "Don't wrestle with a pig because you both get dirty, but the pig likes it." Don't wrestle with a pig because you both get dirty and the pig likes it. Now, obviously that means we don't want to argue with people, because some people just like to argue and criticize. They literally enjoy the process of getting muddy and dirty. And so if we don't like that process, which as leaders in the church, we shouldn't like that process of just arguing with people for no reason, complaining about things and butting heads with people. We shouldn't like that. And so what happens in the process is that the quote unquote pig, not in a derogatory term, just that pigs like to wallow in mud, right? Like the pig pulls us into the mud and gets us dirty along with them. So instead of that happening, when we are criticized in an unfair way, by the way, not all criticism is unfair. There is such a thing as healthy criticism. But when it's unfair, unhealthy criticism, don't let the pig drag you into the mud. So when somebody pulls you aside after service on Sunday and lays into you about how you didn't do enough hymns, or you didn't let their daughter sing on the worship team even though she's 6 years old and can't sing at all, don't get pulled into that. Smile and nod. They're going to eventually get it out of their system, but it is never beneficial for you to go on the defensive and start attacking them as a person, because even if that's what they're doing to you, they probably enjoy that process. Even if they don't want to admit it, they enjoy the process of getting dirty. So don't wrestle with a pig. You'll both get dirty, but the pig will like it. The fourth thing I learned from Carey kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, with not necessarily time management, but this idea of burnout. If you don't know Carey's story, he always talked about how he burnt out, and so he had to figure out a way to overcome that. And so I really wanted to guard myself against that as someone new in ministry. I didn't necessarily reach that point, but I think it was because of Carey's wisdom. And one of the things that he said that really resonated with me when it comes to burnout as a solution to avoid that is that if you don't take the Sabbath will take you. If you don't take the Sabbath will take you. In other words, if you don't find time to rest and rejuvenate in ministry, in life in general, as laid out by God's word, then eventually that is going to catch up with you and you will be forced to take a Sabbath, but it won't be a pleasant Sabbath. It will be a painful Sabbath. And so don't let the Sabbath sneak up on you. Plan it in advance and commit to yourself and say, I am going to take a Sabbath day every single week. And obviously this is really hard for worship leaders, right? Because when is most people's Sabbath day? It's on Sunday, right? And what do worship leaders do on Sunday? We work. We are constantly pouring ourselves out on Sunday. And as you know, if you're in worship ministry, Sundays are pretty much the most tiring day of the week. So don't look around to what everybody else is doing and say, they all take their Sabbath on Sunday, so I need to take my Sabbath on Sunday. Take your Sabbath whenever you can. For you, it might be on Monday. I haven't ever taken a Sabbath on a Monday before, but the more I think about it, like the nicer that sounds. I usually do it on Saturday. Saturday seems to be a good spot. By the way, if you don't take a Sabbath on Saturday because you're trying to get ready for worship on Sunday, there has been no greater benefit to me in my worship ministry than simply committing to taking Saturday off, getting everything done during the week and saying, Saturday is my Sabbath. I'm not going to work on worship stuff. And what happens is, first of all, you learn to fit to that schedule and you get things done by Friday afternoon. And then on that Saturday, it's like a rest period where I almost think of it like whenever you're studying for a test or something, right? Or you're trying to learn a new song on your instrument and you cannot grasp the concept, and then you go to sleep, right? and you wake up in the morning and all of a sudden you know it. You know whatever you were trying to learn. The same thing happens on Saturday. Instead of pushing and trying to memorize those song lyrics and, figure out the intricacies of our worship set, which you should have that figured out before Saturday anyways, but there's something in the rest. I think it's the way that God designed us. There's something in the rest that cements what we've been working on. And if you never take that rest, you're never actually completing that thought process, that learning process, or that planning process for worship. And so rest is actually necessary to your preparation, even though you aren't doing anything, because it cements whatever you've been planning in your mind, and it actually strengthens it. So just from a logistical sense, take a Sabbath for that reason, but also because God commands it. If you don't take the Sabbath will take you. And perhaps the most important thing that Carey has taught me is how to say no. Or maybe it's more just that it's okay to say no, because did you know that it's okay to say no to people? Did you know that you don't owe everybody everything that they ask for? You don't owe everybody an afternoon meeting. You don't owe everybody their song request whenever they want you to sing it in church. You don't owe everybody the opportunity to play on the worship team. Now, obviously, we want to honor people, right? Because we're in a church and we're to honor one another, but I don't think honoring people always means saying yes to them. It's like things get a little complicated whenever you're in church, right? And like if we were outside of the church, then we could make certain decisions that we need to make inside the church. But because we're in the church, it's hard for us to make those decisions. Just a perfect example. I always compare like the worship team to a sports team. And so let's say, you're on the soccer team and somebody comes up to you and they want to join the soccer team. And they're like, hey, I am the best goalie in this area and I need to be on your team. And I'm going to be on your team. There's one hiccup though. I noticed that you practice on Thursday nights and, I can't make it to Thursday night practices, but I will be there for every single game that you have on Sunday. So just count me in. I'm all in. I'm ready to go. If you were the coach of the soccer team, you'd be like, I'm sorry, you don't make it to practice. You can't play on our Sunday games, right? I'm sure you can see the connection here, what I'm going to say. People do that all the time with our worship team too, right? They're like, I can't make it to rehearsal on Thursday, but I can always be there on Sunday. And we're like, well, I know that's not right deep down, but I don't want to say no to people. So sure, come join me. You're doing it for the glory of God, right? But if we were doing it for the glory of God, maybe we would rearrange our schedule to actually be able to be there on Thursday. So there's that side of saying no, but there's also the side of what Carey taught me is that people will never ask you to accomplish your vision. They will only ever ask you to accomplish what they want out of you. Nobody's coming to me and saying, Spencer, I need you to think as hard as you can and plan the best worship set for this Sunday. They would come to me and be like, hey, I need this announcement slide made for Sunday or something along those lines, which they're not always bad things. But if we truly believe that God is leading us through the power of the Holy Spirit and giving us vision and wisdom for our worship ministry, then if we believe in that vision and wisdom that he's given us through prayerful contemplation, then we would guard against the distractions of what the 100 other people think that we should do. And that's not to say that you can't surround yourself with other people and get ideas from them, but you know exactly what I'm talking about, where you need to do something and then somebody comes up to you with some other request and you're like, well, I can't say no, so I just need to do that. My point is, it's okay to say no. You don't have to say yes to everything. Another thing Carey talks about all the time is how whenever you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. Think about that. If you're saying yes to meeting with somebody at 6:30 on a Tuesday, you're saying no to being at home with your wife and kids. If you're saying yes to some even a worship conference that would happen during your regular worship rehearsal time, then you're saying no to that regular worship rehearsal time and pouring into your worship team. Like, there's trade-offs for everything, right? So just make sure that you're saying yes to the right thing, because whether you are saying yes or you're saying no, you're always saying yes and no to something. Now, obviously, Carey doesn't talk specifically about worship ministry stuff, and a lot of those things were things that I just kind of took and ran through my own filter in my mind and applied to my worship ministry. But I do want to give you something that is super specific to worship ministry, something super practical. That's why I've linked down in the description below the worship rehearsal blueprint. It's a free blueprint, free PDF guide that will teach you how to run the perfect worship rehearsal that will help you lead your team well, not just musically so they know the songs for Sunday, but also spiritually so they grow closer to God, and relationally so that they grow closer together. So check that out down in the description below, the worship rehearsal blueprint. And until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.